G'day everyone. Thought I'd talk to you today about the differences between the A9 and the A7 III. Now that I've had those cameras a number of months, obviously I've had the A9 much longer and I've had the A7 III a number of months as well. I thought I'd talk to you about the comparison between the two of them because I'm still getting an awful lot of people saying, would you recommend the A9 or would you recommend to get the A7 III? So I thought I'd go over the benefits of each one, which one is still my favourite and things like that. I thought I'd take you all through that. I was originally setting up a Word document to take you through it all, but I found this great comparison from this site here, which I thought I'd take you through, and I'll put the link down below to sort of take you through this, and then we can sort of have a discussion about that in the questions down below if you'd like to comment on it as well. So, you know, we're looking at the two cameras here. You have to excuse me too, I've got a cold. So these are the two actual cameras here. You know, obviously this one on this side is the A7 III, this is the A9. You can see very, very close if you look at them, apart from a couple of controls that are different that I'm going to take you through the pictures in a second, and then I'll talk about my own usage with it as well. But let's go and have a look at this comparison because it's quite interesting when you go through it. It's just talking about the main differences, but it's basically the 10 main differences, and they were going to be the same things that I was going to write down anyway, but I thought I'd take you through the whole lot. Now, if you're looking at them, these are the things that are actually common between the two of them. They're saying the design basically is very, very similar, and I'll show you that in a minute. There's just a couple of differences. But the A7 III is obviously a little bit lighter, and the rear LCD monitor, they both have a rear LCD monitor with touchscreen focus capabilities. The ISO is similar between the two of them. 5-axis stabilization. They have 4K video, full pixel readout, 1.2 crop at 30 frames per second. The battery is the same, the Z battery. They both have dual card slots. Only one is UHS 2. They both have Wi-Fi, NFC, and Bluetooth. So you can see, if you look at the design between the two of them, they are very, very close. If you look at them, there's not really many differences at all, apart from this extra controls that you actually have up here that I'll talk about in a minute. If you're looking at the back, basically exactly the same. Top down, you can see that they're basically the same, apart from these extra controls as well. So they are very, very similar in how they look. Now, if you're looking at them, really the only difference if you're looking at them aesthetically are these extra controls. And I won't show you this one because there's nothing different about it, but excuse me. With this one, obviously, you've got this little extra control that we've got here. Now, I love this, and once you get used to this control, it's very, very hard to go back. Let me just see if I can turn it around the right way. Yeah, it's very hard to go back and get out of this because it is really... I'm just trying to get it to focus. It is really handy and useful. I do really like to have these sort of controls that you can feel, tactile controls, and that's why the Fuji are so good. And I'm wondering about their mirrorless in Nikon, for instance, whether they're going to go a similar way. But I do really like to have all those controls. It does save you from going into the menu, so you do save time, and that's obviously why, this being a sports camera, they've put more controls where they're easily accessible, because you don't have to try and go through menus to find them. Even though I don't find the menus that much of an issue at all, it's still quicker, because on this you can change your focusing. All your focusing modes are down the bottom down here, and then obviously on the top here you've got all of your your modes for saying high speed, your normal modes, your self timer, bracketing, and all that comes from this dialog box here, which is really nice. It has a lockable lock on it, and it's just beautiful to have that tactile feel. And I find whenever I go back to the A7 III, I'm always looking for that. So it's a bit of an awkward thing having both sometimes, because I forget that I have to go through the menus on the A7 III. So that is a really wonderful thing, having those extra controls. And that's why Sony did it on the A9, because they realised sports shooters may have to change things very, very fast. And that's why you've got that ability there to do that as well. Okay, so let's talk about the sensor that's used here Basically, it's saying that, I'll say up front, the following 3 points are the main reason you'd want to go or consider an A9 over the A7 III. And basically, there's nothing like the sensor that's in the A9. It really is in a league of its own. It's saying here, first of all, both cameras feature a 24 megapixel sensor, so they are both 24 megapixels with backside illuminated technology. But it says here that the A7 III chip includes a front-end LSI that doubles the speed of the camera, but that is nothing compared to the A9. The flagship E-mount camera uses a stacked Exmor RS sensor, which includes integral memory, and this is the big difference between both of these two cameras, that makes the sensor readout and processing speeds 10 times faster than that of the A7 III. So that's really interesting, and that's the reason why you don't get things like rolling shutter and things like that the same way with that camera. If, for instance, if you're getting movement, you can't really shoot movement with the A7 III. You really need the A9, and that's been shown where they showed the golfer with the golf swing, and he actually swung his the club and it didn't bend, whereas you'll get that with the A7 III. You just can't do that with the A7 III. The other thing too is you can get banding on the A7 III. I've never had banding with the A9, and I proved that in another video that I had a discussion about that. It's saying here that this results in faster burst speeds, shutter speeds, and live view. It also minimizes distortion, and that's the main difference between the A9 and the A7 III. And also banding, because I showed that too, that you just don't get banding with the A9. I've seen it a couple of times, someone said they've had it, but I've never had it. I've never had banding with the A9, where I have had banding with the A7 III. That's caused by using the electronic shutter. And this is one of the big differences between the two of them, that I can with confidence, and I do nearly always shoot in electronic shutter with the A9, and I've been in some very, very challenging locations with it. So I can use silent shutter in weddings and receptions or wherever I want to use it, and feel really confident that there's not going to be any issues with using that electronic shutter. I don't believe you can do the same thing with the A9 yet, with the A7 III. Yes, you can try and use, say, trying to match or double the frequency, the hertz of the local lighting, but there's still no guarantee. I tried that in my kitchen with lights, that I actually showed how I tried every setting basically to try and get rid of it, and there was still extensive banding there. And I've also had people contact me to say that they've done the same thing. They've shot a wedding or whatever, and they've actually had banding that's appeared in their images, and they've done dance recitals and they've been there. The problem is it doesn't always show on the back of the LCD screen or even in the EVF, and that's the problem. You don't notice until you get home. So I'm saying to people that if you are shooting this for money and it's a one-off event like a wedding or a dance recital or something like that that's so important that can't be reshot, you should never use the electronic shutter with the A7 III. You can only trust the A9 for that. So I just wanted to sort of mention that to you. And it just says, in our experience with the A9, we never encountered any of those issues. But they're saying there, of course, we have yet to see, because this was, I think, released not long after the A7 III was out. But I did do a test on that, and I did see banding. I just don't think it's worth it. I always use mechanical shutter if I'm shooting with the A7 III. It also says here too, and this is an important thing as well, that the new camera, this is the A7 III, doesn't take advantage of the electronic shutter to the same extent that the A9 does. And that's talking about shutter speed, because the A7 III is limited to 1/8000th of a second. The A9 can do 1/32,000. Now, that's really amazing for me, because what it gives me the ability to do is to shoot 1.4, like with my Sony 35 1.4, and I can shoot wide open and use 1/32,000th of a second if I need to. Yes, you could use NDs, but that's something else that I have to add. It's another thing that I have to do. With the A9, I don't have to worry about that. I can shoot wide open in broad daylight and sunlight and just crank up that shutter speed. And it really has given me beautiful results, and I love that aspect of it. That's one thing where I just get the A9 alone. It really has changed the way that I've shot weddings. You know, I can use it to sort of grab a groom standing in in the sun, and if I wanted to highlight on his lapel or whatever, and I can use it wide open so the background's blown away. I don't have to carry around NDs or whatever. It really does change the way that I shoot. So it is a fantastic thing. So let's keep going. So number 2, continuous shooting speed and buffer. So what they're saying here is that I'll just drag this down a little bit, that the stack sensor of the A9 elevates the continuous shooting to 20 frames per second with AE and AF tracking, and it does. It's amazing. Once you've used that, it's incredible. I shot recently a wedding where the bride and groom released dubs, and I was able to capture that perfect moment because I was shooting at that 20 frames per second. I could capture that perfect moment, which I wouldn't have been able to get with the a7iii. Yes, the a7iii is still amazing, and this is not bagging the a7iii. I adore my a7iii. I'm just talking to you about the differences. When people say there's not differences here, for certain things there are, other things the a7iii is going to be better, so we'll still get to that, but I'm just trying to talk to you about what the differences are between the A9 and the a7iii. So being able to capture that exact moment because you've got that much higher frame rate can mean the difference of getting a shot or not getting the shot. It's saying now mechanical-wise, the A9 is not very good because it actually tops out at 5 frames per second. So if you did need to go to mechanical, like if you were using flash, for instance, the a7iii is going to be a much better camera. Because if I'm using my Pro Photo lights and I want to, then you have to go mechanical, because the second you put a flash onto the camera, you have to use mechanical. You're going to get a much better result with the a7iii because I can use 10 frames per second if I need to. And so as long as your flash will keep up, the a7iii is better if you're dealing with mechanical flash. Excuse me again. Another advantage of the A9 concerns the buffer memory. It can record 362 JPEGs and 241 compressed RAW files. The a7iii will do 177 and 89 RAWs, which is still amazing for what you're paying for that camera. But again, it just doesn't do what the A9 will give us. So let's keep going down because I want to talk about number 3, which is live view. And this basically is talking about here. One of the great things, and this is very hard to go back on, once you use the A9 and you get no blackout at all with the EVF, is amazing, because I often shoot dancers, and if they're running across the screen coming into the image and I've got to capture that perfect moment, having a blackout for a few frames can mean that you miss that moment. You just can't track effectively. So not having any blackout at all really makes it amazing, so you never miss that moment. So this is one of the big differences between the a7iii and the A9. You can see here that you get an uninterrupted view with the A9. It's saying basically here, I appreciate that I appreciate the most about the A9 is the possibility to record 10 frames per second or 20 frames per second without any lag or any blackouts in the EVF or the LCD screen. Thanks to the powerful processor and the sensor, and that's the reason why it can do that, because of that different sensor that this camera has. And if you look down here, you can sort of see what's happening if you look at this dialog box, this graphic that they're showing here, that the A9 is continuous the whole way through. There's no blackout at all. Whereas the a7iii will give you blackouts in between. So that's the issue. So it does actually cause an issue if you're doing that. Now, if you are actually shooting, it's saying down here, if you look at it, that the a7iii can give you live view with blackouts up to 8 frames per second, while at 10 frames per second you see the last image taken. So once you get up to 10 frames per second, you'll only see the last image that's actually taken. So it's nowhere near what the A9 will give you in that respect. So let's move on to autofocus. Autofocus, both cameras have 693 phase detection points, but it is the highest of any full-frame mirrorless camera out there. There is, however, a big difference in the number of contrast detection points. Now, it's saying here that the a7iii has 425 areas, whereas the A9 only has 25. Now, why does this matter? Well, it does matter if you're shooting in very low light. Because in theory, the low light shooting of the a7 III then should be way better, because if you're dealing with low light scenarios, that uses contrast. So having that many more contrast detection points should give you the ability to shoot much better in low light than what the A9 can. But to be honest, I've used both, and I really haven't noticed any difference. So I'm not quite sure what voodoo Sony have done there with the A9, but I really haven't noticed any difference in focusing between the two of them in low light. They seem to be really comparable. If you're dealing with normal daylight shooting, though, you've got to remember too, and it does say in this document, that the A9 has much better calculations. Now, that's because of the processor that's actually on there, the sensor. It will be way faster. It's 60 times per second. So the issue is, if you're dealing with having autofocus, the A9 will be calculating autofocus quicker. That's why if you're dealing with sports, for instance, the tracking and things like that will be better. And I've noticed the tracking is definitely a little bit better with the A9. It's not drastically better though, but it is still a little bit better than what you'll get with the a7 III. So that is also one of the advantages of having that better sensor that's involved again. Like I've said, for focus particularly, I think they're both pretty well on par if you're dealing with low light. I haven't really noticed any difference at all. Let's keep going down, because it's talking about the electronic viewfinder. This is another area where it is different with the A9. The A9 has the same viewfinder as what the a7R III has. You can see here the resolutions that are listed there, but I've definitely noticed that when you compare them side by side, like for instance, if I have both cameras, and I do use these, like I said, in weddings and everything all the time, if I'm immediately going from one to the other, I can clearly see that the A9 is a better EVF, much better. But if you don't do that, if you haven't got both cameras side by side together like that and you're not doing it, you don't really notice a difference. The only area where you really notice a difference is if you are doing manual focusing for video. Because if you're after critical focus, the higher the resolution of the EVF, the better your critical focus will be. Now, I've had some people say to me they have no issues with the a7 III, but I can tell the difference if I'm doing manual focus. When I'm doing macro work, it's much easier to get that perfect focus with the A9 than it is with the a7 III because of that better EVF. So you are getting a better EVF with the A9. Let's go down to number 6. It's talking about picture profiles. And you can see here that it actually says, let me just make this a little bit bigger for you here. You can see here that the A9 does have promising video. In fact, I'd still say that the A9 is the best video camera that I've got if you're dealing with using standard profiles. There's something about the A9 that is just amazing. The focus is just outstanding, but there's something about the way that works, that sensor. It's the only camera that Sony have full frame that you can shoot in Super 35 or full frame without any penalty at all. The a7 III, for instance, there is a slight loss in quality as soon as you go to Super 35 mode. So the A9, there is no penalty at all. You can go to Super 35 or full frame without any loss of quality at all, and that is a big deal really if you want to be shooting Super 35 mode without losing any quality. But where it does start to fall down is that the A9 doesn't have the log profiles, S-Log2 and S-Log3. The creative styles for stills. So they're things that are missing from the A9. It really is, if you want to have that full dynamic range, if you do want to be shooting log, well then clearly the a7 III is a much better video camera than what the A9 is. And that's one thing you may want to consider if you're dealing with this. I don't shoot log, I tend to shoot just the standard profile, and everyone is always amazed when I show the images that I'm actually using, that they have been shot with the standard profile. I found that they are, by far for me, the best profile that's there, and I only need to do very little editing in Final Cut, and I'm really happy with how it looks. But if you do want to get the full dynamic range, clearly you're going to have to go for the a7 III. Let's keep going down. Drive mode, obviously this is the thing that I mentioned before, that on the A9 you're getting this extra drive mode. So it means you don't have to go through menus and things like that. Just let me put my watch on silent because it keeps buzzing. So that's another thing that I really love. And once you get used to using that dial, it is really nice. And you can also change, like I said, the AF points all come down from the bottom here. So you can change, from your continuous to your single focus and things like that down the bottom. And it's just nice to have all that ability just to do a quick change on the top. And it really is a nice feature. Number 8, I've never used these, to be honest, so really they're irrelevant to me, but I'm sure sports photographers would use them. They do have a LAN port and also a flash sync port, but I've never used either of those. So for me, really, to be honest, it's irrelevant. But if you do have a use for that, like if you did want to attach to a FTP server for sport shooters, it certainly is an advantage. Number 9, they're talking about battery life. The a7iii has a better battery life, and that's because obviously of the lower EVF, and probably because of the sensor as well. That is having an impact on the battery life. But to be honest, battery life now on these cameras is amazing. I find that I can shoot a full day, a full wedding, usually by the end of the reception, or say 3/4 way through the reception, I have to change to my second battery. So I easily can get by a whole day with using 2 batteries. And I suppose lastly, the price. There's around about a $2,000 difference. I just checked this morning, a little bit over $2,000. The A9 is coming down in price, but there's still a drastic difference if you're dealing between, paying $2,000 to $4,200 or whatever it was that I checked this morning. So it is, I suppose, a massive difference if you're dealing with that. So rather than going through that conclusion, I just thought I'd conclude myself about what I think about the two of them. To be honest, I'm absolutely thrilled that I have both cameras. I really am in the best world. I still prefer the A9. For me, is still the best camera that I've ever had, and that's because of things like that little bit of better focusing, the no blackout EVF. Being able to shoot at 1/32,000th of a second is just beautiful. And once I've become used to that, it's very hard to go back. Having that extra dial on the top for when I'm doing things very quickly, when I'm doing weddings, is just amazing, and I love it. And that's the reason why, for me, my A9 is still my number 1 body, and the a7iii is the backup body to that. And also, I've found that the A9's video is also exceptional as well. It is a cut above everything else, as long as you only want to use a standard profile. The second you want to go into anything else, though, the a7iii for video is better because you've got the log profiles and things like that in it. So then that becomes a better video camera overall, which means, I suppose, overall, if you're dealing with Fusion and you want to have everything involved in the one camera and the price of that camera, the a7iii is the best Fusion type camera that's available out there, because it is a full-on videography camera as well as an amazing stills camera. If you're dealing with flash, the a7iii beats the A9 because you can shoot up to 10 frames per second with the a7iii. You only have a mechanical shutter of 5 frames per second with the A9, so that's another issue. If you're dealing with sport shooting, well, obviously having 20 frames per second, or even if you're in dancing, shooting dancers, jumping across the stage or whatever, the A9 has a definite advantage because it has got that 20 frames per second, and it also has, for weddings and dancing, a fully working silent shutter. You can't trust the a7iii due to the sensor readout is not fast enough. So that's one thing with that. And as a professional earning my living from doing photography, there's no way I'd use the a7iii in electronic shutter. I'd be using mechanical shutter. And having 10 frames per second, that's not an issue anyway. It just doesn't have that ability to shoot silently without any cost like the A9 does. So let me know what you think about that anyway. I'd be really curious to see what you guys have to say about that in the comments down below. And I'll see you all again soon for the next video. Bye for now.